Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist. Learn languages, make a difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Ibra Lopez, and today I have the pleasure of joining Jamie Banks for HYPIA research. Jamie, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So my first question, Jamie, is can you tell us a little bit about your language background? What languages do you speak? Do you even think it makes sense to count languages?
The counting, I hate it. Especially I do a lot of ancient languages, so you're like, which proficiency scale do you speak? That's very
Right.
complicated.
Mhm.
But basically, I'm a PhD candidate in classics, so Latin and Greek right now. I actually do speak Latin, and that's key to my research interests. Or I don't know, talk about that. Yeah, so before grad school, I was a language teacher, Spanish mostly, German, and then what else? Some Greek and Latin. So I come to it from a sort of pedagogical point of view.
Mhm.
And in my own language journey, I my Latin, as I got more fluent in Latin, that helped me a lot with Spanish and Italian, not surprisingly. And then other languages, so German and French. French is in some sense a heritage language for me because I'm Canadian.
Mhm.
Also, German and French, I really learned them for my research initially. I went way beyond that in German, like theater and stuff, but initially my German was to pass my PhD translation exam. What it helps me
Mhm.
with now, really, that sort of high proficiency in the languages, is not being confined to Anglophone scholarship. So the dissertation, the poet that I'm writing on, is the scholarship on him is very small, but almost all of it is not in English, and he's a Frenchman himself, writing in Latin. So I think individually the languages helped each other in terms of my learning them, and then they started out in a research context for me and professional use, both as a teacher and as a researcher. And then I just kind of got a more personal connection, and that actually parallels the kind of journey that I am tracking in a lot of my research as well.
Fascinating. And so two things grab my attention. The first one is what we already discussed by email, right? The fact that you actually speak Latin and how does that influence a critical perspective on language? And the
Mhm.
second one is how does your research intersect with a critical perspective on polyglossia?
Absolutely. So to the first, I speak Latin in order to read it. It also happens to be fun for me because I'm a nerd, but the second language acquisition research tells us, we learn by input. There's various, we could quibble about details and exactly how, but basically there shouldn't be a difference pedagogically and in terms of how the brain acquires language versus learns it between a modern language and an ancient language. So for me, speaking Latin, because some people consider it kind of a party trick or they kind of look at you funny, like that's like why bother? It's like arrogant. But for me, like the only reason I can do the research that I do, which involves reading sometimes 40 pages of Latin that no one's ever translated every day, I only have that level of reading fluency because I speak it, and my brain is. It's not something. It's not a puzzle I try and solve. I'm not doing grammar translation. I'm not talking about the language. And also, we know from bilingualism or multilingualism research that you have an identity, and different social different parts of your personality too. All kinds of things are tied up in your different languages. So speaking Latin gives me, I have friendships that I only share Latin with the person, no other language. And so it's speaking Latin has given me a genuine personal and emotional connection to the language. That for my research I posit is actually true for many more people historically than we think it is. But also it just makes it matter more to me in the way that's not abstract. It's not a way to get better SAT scores. It's no more than a language, but it's also no less than a language. It has its own history and identity that you can form around it, all that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, and
And then
that's
you
why
asked
the
about,
slogan at
yeah.
yes, please go ahead.
Oh, sorry. You asked about the critical polyglot studies or the critical lens on languages. A couple things. One, I think, so we have the idea of, rejecting the idea that language is a commodity. We're not, stamp collecting and, divorcing language from the culture of its various linguistic communities that speak it. In my research, I want to essentially say, like, So my research is in the early modern period primarily. So what we would used to call the Renaissance, and after that, and you have it's no longer Latin is no longer anyone's native language, but it is used as it's partly a prestige language. It is, but it's used by scientists, by other writers, by humanists, and people writing literature, and it's still across Europe and to some extent the Americas post sort of the start of colonization. And so you have Latin as having linguistic communities, but no native speakers. So they're kind of both. Everyone has kind of equal access to them in a certain way. No one has, like in terms of native speakerism, no one has like absolute kind of authority to say like this is proper Latin, or
Hmm.
there's no one community it belongs to more than others. On the other hand, people really wanted that to be the case. They would fight, oh, if you don't write like Cicero, then you're not, your Latin is worse, or still lots of judginess going on, and there's still lots of
Hmm.
politics to at that time to what kind of Latin you speak or how good your Latin is. So it's an interesting case study, I think, for native speakers and what happened. Kind of similar to Esperanto, actually, which is one of my other languages, where
Hmm.
there's no one now, maybe one or two, but there's no native speakers. I would think of it as a chosen language, and so, but there's that competition. Traditionally, Latin is thought of more as, even in German, the phrase is still like Sprache der Gelehrten, so the learned language of Europe kind of thing. You imagine these white man scholars in their rooms, and
Hmm.
so it's treated as a language where like it's only a higher register, and where you do serious work in diplomacy, and your theology and your church bulletins, and also your science in Latin. But actually, there's letters, there's a republic of letters, there's letters, private letters that are going on even between scientists. There's the science inserting their sort of classical references or their personal jokes. They're being people in the language, and that gets lost in sort of the traditional ways that we think of Latin as like, oh, it must have been the prestige language of quote Western Europe, blah blah blah.
Hmm.
I also think it's just more
Yes.
fun if we think of it as like being humans who do it.
Hmm. Hmm. Yes, so it's just fascinating. So a number of threads here. Now, the first one that emerges is precisely the motto of the hyperpolyglot activists is learn languages make a difference, right? And you pointed out to that social embedding of the language, as opposed to its commodification is this embedment as something that is not necessarily related to any given community or does not allow you to tend bridges that are identitarian or emotional with the people that speak that language, right? The second one is that surprisingly, removing a community of L1 speakers from the equation does not remove competition,
Yeah,
anxiety, or the language ideology of ownership over language,
yeah,
right? So
yeah,
it simply
yeah,
displaces it into skills or competence or fidelity to a certain writer like Julius Caesar, right?
yeah. And that's something we see in that. So there is a community. I'm not just the only spoken Latinist. There's a community of spoken Latinists who do it for various reasons. And I think, you see infighting about, should we, can we say like aeroplano or something, or should we use a word? Should we use the
Mhm.
word for air and ship to say an airplane? So even now, and this started with Neo Latin, so early modern humanists, that kind of thing. How much do we innovate, and how much is it, and what are the value judgments like? They place a
Mhm.
moral value almost on, like, some people choose to innovate, some people would choose to stay strictly to classical usage as like it's fossilized in the like, traditional canon, and
Right.
there's like pedagogical reasons to do the latter. You want to be able to
Mhm.
use the language that is actually in the text that kids will read. On the other hand, like, what's stopping us from having playing games? There's people who play game do like walkthroughs of games and narrate it in Latin, and they have to use tons of new words and just make them up. And it's also a
Right.
competence in language to be creative in it and make new stuff. So there's competing tendencies there in terms of what actually
Yes.
is competency and what's sort of quote allowed.
Right, right. Yes, I've experienced the same thing with Judeo-Spanish, which is also a cocktail
Mm-hmm.
party trick and all of these aspects.
Mm-hmm.
And I've called this implicit prescriptivism because it seems as though as much as we want to adopt a hands-off approach, a non-prescriptivist approach, we are forced to make decisions, right? We are forced to
Yeah.
represent the language with an image for a video game or to decide on innovations. And there's a trade-off, as you said, right? There is no perfect solution. There are competing reasons towards that.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
other aspect that fascinates me is the fact that a lot of people nowadays are trying to standardize languages in the image of quote unquote modern languages, right? So they're saying, listen, Spanglish is a legitimate language. So perhaps there could be a
Mhm.
dictionary of Spanglish, much like variationism, right? Said, okay, there's an African American vernacular. Can we then make a dictionary, a grammar, and orthography about it? So it seems that in a world that is still grappling with critical social linguistics, with moving away from variationism, Latin gives us the opposite direction. So we're not trying to formalize a linguistic practice that is not taken seriously enough, but we're trying to show that a
Right.
linguistic practice that has been reduced to only formal, serious purposes can actually
Yeah.
expand its range of using to informal usages, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's really, in terms of like, I was thinking about this before this call, like, when we say we commodify a language, we often say that that's often taken to be like, if you devalue it, you make it only a
Hmm.
commodity. But Latin,
Right.
essentially, we've commodified to some extent by giving it such high status and such sort of abstracts, like by giving it so much prestige, we've made it so that people tell their kids to study Latin so that they'll like improve their mind or whatever bullshit about that. So rather than like saying it's a language. It's not more than a language. It's not this commodity in this like intense
Right.
prestige way.
Right.
But it's not less than a language. Easy. We need to in a way we need to take like you said. We need to take usage seriously, so we need to take Latin seriously as a language with the literature, rather than caring about it, especially in K to 12, largely as like a marker for class status or education exam.
Right. Yes, I was going to say that. What do you think about the class and race bias around Latin? How do you see the situation?
Yeah, so I'm at the City University of New York, and it's a fascinating place to teach what we call classics, terrible name. So with the linguistics background students I have, when I teach Latin itself, because I have Spanish, I'll give like some of my Spanish speaking students will have a leg up in Latin grammar compared to people who only took English because they know about
Hmm.
conjugation. People who have German, for example, also will know about inflection. So there's all these
Hmm.
linguistic resources that students bring who either they have those languages as an additional language or that's their L1 is not English. And so I try and drive, use treat students as experts in their own linguistic sort of profile and environment, and draw that out from them to hopefully give them both like less traumatic experience of Latin class, which the way we traditionally teach it is just rough for a lot of people, but
Right.
also
Right.
to sort of like I really do believe, yeah, it's not just sort of an equity thing about like, oh, we should get Latin should be less white. I mean, it should be. And there's lots of bullshit involved in the politics. But more than that, it's actually just more interesting and more in touch with the reality of Latin as a language to treat it
Hmm.
pedagogically too as having all these other influences.
Hmm.
And then other stuff I teach. So for example, there's a Greek and Latin roots class at Hunter College within the classics department. And one thing I kind of unusual there that I have CUNY students do is to do a sort of linguistic autobiography. And so sort of some of the questions come from what you would think of as more of a sociolinguistics kind of background or language ideology, where it's sort of like, I'm asking them, what were the languages used at home?
Hmm.
Kind of what's your biography there? But also trying to teach some of their attitudes about language. Because
Right.
I really want to be like super upfront and be like, okay, like the things that people told you about, what we would consider the deficit model of bilingualism, like don't please don't believe there's anymore. Like don't have any shame about not being, like a lot of what you've been sold as, you're you're lesser for whatever reason
Hmm.
linguistically, often racially coded and class coded as well. I really want to give students, even in that Greek and Latin roots classics course, to say, you have linguistic resources and
Right.
you should be listened to.
Right.
In
Yeah,
many cases,
fascinating.
more so
And
than the kids who have early access. So,
mhm. How do you structure that assignment, that language autobiography? Do you ask for a specific amount of words or length, or then an explanation, an oral defense of that, or just in
right.
written?
Totally. I have a questionnaire, but I kind of tell them, fill out the parts that you find interesting, or that
Hmm.
seem relevant to you. So it's pretty wide ranging, and I adapted this from a colleague who's more on the linguist and history of English side of things.
Hmm.
But some of the questions are like, um, you know, if you're, what languages do you speak? Because not all of them are multi or by are multilingual. But how are you treated in school? Then, if any, if they have any job experience, etc. How are you treated that you think was influenced by that language? When do you use, if you have different languages, when do you use each of them? What were
Hmm.
you taught about like the value of your different languages, or what messaging did you get? And also but also stuff like, you know, did you, what language, kind of family elect kind of stuff. What language was used in your family? What was allowed or disallowed by your parents versus the school? But then also like speech differences or something. Did you, have any speech therapy or whatever it is. And I don't,
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
because both because like that's a lot of questions. I wouldn't ask them to do all of them, but also because I
Hmm.
want them to sort of have a positive experience with like reflecting on these questions, rather than feel like that if there's an area where like it's very personal or uncomfortable, like no, you don't have
Right,
to tell me. It's none of my business if you don't want me to know. So I'm trying to,
right.
because for the most part they haven't been asked, especially in an academic setting, to reflect on that language in that kind of detailed way. I want them to reflect. I want them to have lots to be able to chew on. But the only thing I'm asking from them back is the stuff that they want to tell me. It's essentially a structured way for them to tell me about their language world.
Hmm. Hmm. And you also mentioned two labels for Latin. First as an ancient, or what other people would label as ancient, and then as classical. And I think this is a
Mm.
very important aspect because we've seen, at least in academia, from my perspective, a transition from modern languages department to world languages departments, right?
Mm.
And here the idea, I think, is
Yeah.
that modern is often code for colonial languages, right? So that if we want to be
Yeah.
more inclusive,
Mm.
then we should use world, which is also a move away from foreign languages, again, which
Yeah.
presupposes nation state boundaries, etc. So, whereas you commented that in second language acquisition, there is no cognitive difference in the way in which we acquire a so-called ancient language versus a so-called modern language. So what are your thoughts on the labels ancient, classical, and modern as applied to Latin?
Sure. Classical, the reason I half jokingly said I don't like classics as a name for the field is that it just reifies and adds on value judgments about like what do we actually mean is just Latin and Greek. There's a disciplinary
Hmm.
history very much tied up with colonialism as to why those two are privileged above others. But in terms of world language is an interesting one, because Latin not was to extent a world language for a long time in that limited way where there like weren't it was a super regional language anyway and had a lot of users if not speakers. Um, Classical I just want to stay away from unless we're saying unless we're adding languages to the classical kind of realm.
Right.
So like Ancient Exchanges is a translation journal out of the University of Iowa, and I really like them because they say that they do literary translation, accept literary translations from literally ancient languages. That's their frame.
Hmm.
They do say they kind of ask then what counts as ancient, and they sometimes use the word classical as well, and like classical Chinese, Sanskrit, indigenous languages that of like pre-modern empires. They
Right.
do their best in terms, depending on what editors they have who can evaluate stuff, to really
Hmm.
have a wide umbrella. So I'm only
Right.
really for classical languages if we're using it to do the reverse of gatekeeping, which we usually aren't doing.
Right. And you mentioned the journal Ancient Exchanges, right? Which I wasn't familiar with.
Yeah.
So that leads me to the next question, which is, a big component of HYPIA Research 2.0 is publications. do you envisage or do you have in mind any journals or publication types that you would like to target in the following months or years?
Yeah, sure. So interesting. So interesting exchanges. I mentioned also. I have published there
Mm-hmm.
from ancient Latin, scientific Latin, and so the other thing I do like besides the sort of bilingualism stuff or the genre of Neo Latin and literature that I'm most interested in is kind of crosses between science and poetry. So my dissertation
Mm-hmm.
is in some ways like a side quest, but it is also it's really a case
Mm-hmm.
study for all of these. So I do want to so my
Right.
the poem I'm writing on is it's a very late poem that's an imitation of an ancient poet who's writing on what we would call science. But
Mm-hmm.
it was written in Latin by Frenchmen and translated very rapidly into a bunch of different vernaculars. So it gives me a
Mm-hmm.
case study to say like, okay, why would you translate this, and what were the motivations and ideologies motivating like what how people thought it would be received if you had vernacular translation. So most
Mm-hmm.
immediately, my focus is my dissertation to get this thing done, and I want to, but I'm using that to say I want to probably publish something as a case this poem as and its translations as a case study for
Mm-hmm.
dynamics between Latin and the vernaculars in this period. It's
Mm-hmm.
in terms of also in terms of like code switching, or code switching old frame, but and then also I do for Neo Latin. I think it's especially important to just translate stuff and provide critical texts with translation and critical introduction. Because I think
Mm-hmm.
one way we can in order to study we have to first have the data, and more than
Mm-hmm.
99% of anything ever written in Latin, even the literary stuff, has is untranslated. Because
Mm-hmm.
there's far more volumes, more written post classical, written post ancient times than there. So in some ways, I'm holding this we've talked about as like a research program in mind that really does intersect with critical sociolinguistics. At the same
Mm-hmm.
time, the work I'm doing right now is a lot of it is legwork on the ground, just making these things accessible so that I'm not the only one who can talk about this particular text and we can study it together. So
Mm-hmm.
before to some extent before the theory, there has to be just primary data about the texts.
Right, right. Yeah, completely agree. And also with your portrayal of the dissertation as something to get done. Yes, the dissertation is something we
Yeah,
abandon.
trying to talk
Uh,
myself
uh,
that.
yes,
Yeah,
and it's never finished. So at some point you have to make a judgment and say, listen, this is good enough. And then
yeah, yeah,
it will take so many other directions in terms of publications,
yeah,
and whether it comes out as a book or a case study in a journal, you never know, right? It's impossible
yeah.
to imagine. But I do wish you the very best of luck. Congratulations on your publications on Asian exchanges, and inshallah, as part of HYPIA Research 2.0, we will be able to publish much more things of high quality.
Yeah, I'm really excited.
All right, thank you so much, Jamie, and look forward to working with you.
Thank you. You too, Carlos.
Oh.